It's more the execution today than the pace. 6 words from Fred Vasseur, delivered flat, almost as an aside to reporters standing around him in the paddock. No excitement in his voice, no spin, just a team principal correcting the record after his two cars finished fourth and fifth in a race everyone had already written off as a Ferrari flop. That sentence is the whole story, and almost nobody is talking about it the right way. Here's what the headlines actually said after Budapest. Ferrari wasted a golden opportunity. Ferrari flopped in Hungary. Two cars that started the weekend on pole watch finished behind a McLaren, a Red Bull, and a Mercedes. On the surface, that reads exactly like every other disappointing Ferrari Sunday this season. But surface readings are exactly what get exposed when somebody actually pulls the timing sheets. So before I tell you what Vasseur said next, look at what the stopwatch actually recorded that weekend. Because the gap between the two is the entire reason this story matters. Hamilton topped second practice with a lap over a tenth clear of Charles Leclerc, who had already topped the first session by more than 4/10 over Max Verstappen. In qualifying, Hamilton was actually quicker than Leclerc across the board, only losing out to Lando Norris's pole time in the very last moment. Second on the grid would have been his, had a penalty not intervened. Now compare that to where the car actually finished. Leclerc set the outright fastest lap of the entire race. Hamilton, despite crossing the line in fifth, posted the second closest gap to Norris's best lap of anyone on the grid, closer than Verstappen, closer than the championship leader himself. A car that was fastest, or nearly fastest, in every single session of the weekend finished fourth and fifth. That gap between what the data says and what the finishing order says is not a rounding error, it's the entire argument. Subscribe right now if you want the version of this story the highlight reels skip past, and tell me in the comments which country you're watching from. Because how surprising this is probably depends on how closely you've actually been watching Ferrari's practice pace all season. So take that gap and put it in front of the one man whose job is to explain it. When Fred Vasseur was asked after the race whether Ferrari genuinely had race-winning pace hiding underneath a bad result, he didn't dodge the question and he didn't inflate it either. He said it's difficult to really understand the pace because clean air is key and that first of all, it wasn't a good Sunday. That sounds like an admission of weakness until you hear the second half of what he said. Asked directly to compare his team to the field, he pointed straight at Norris, who was flying whenever he had the road to himself, and then made the actual comparison that matters. He said if you put Charles second at turn 1 instead of Oscar Piastri, it could have been a different race entirely. That is not a coach making excuses. That is a technical read delivered by the man who has access to every telemetry channel on both cars, telling you the car was never the problem. Keep that sentence in your head, because it comes back at the end in a very different context. Here's where this actually gets interesting, because the raw lap time doesn't tell you where the advantage lives, and where it lives tells you everything about whether it's repeatable. Look at the sector breakdown behind Leclerc's fastest lap of the entire race. His second sector speed, 249 kilometers per hour, stands as the best of anyone in that timing table, right through the flowing medium speed section of the circuit. But the technical low-speed final sector, the part with almost no room to breathe, belonged to Norris and Antonelli, not to Ferrari. So even on the single fastest lap of the entire race, the advantage wasn't spread evenly. It was concentrated in one specific part of the track, the part built around a rear wing upgrade, that debuted with extra winglet elements specifically engineered to generate downforce through exactly those medium-speed corners. That's not luck showing up in a sector time. That's a structural gain, sitting exactly where the engineers designed it to sit. Do the actual math on what that structural gain is worth, because a lap time number by itself is almost meaningless without context. Ferrari's top speed on the straights, 351 kilometers per hour for Hamilton, 345 for Leclerc, doesn't even crack the top of the speed trap chart. Several midfield cars clock faster in a straight line. So Ferrari isn't finding this lap time from the power unit, and it isn't finding it from a low drag setup either. It's finding it purely from mechanical grip and aerodynamic balance through the corners that actually decide lap time at a circuit like the Hungaroring. That's the more valuable kind of speed to have, because it's the kind that survives a strategy mistake. It's the kind that was still there on Sunday, underneath 4 penalties and 2 botched pit stops, when everything else about the weekend had already gone wrong. If you're not subscribed yet, this is exactly the kind of story you'll want to already be following, because the next test of this exact pace comes in 3 weeks, and the stakes only go up from here. Was Vasseur just being diplomatic in front of the cameras? Softening a bad weekend the way every team principal softens a bad weekend? Here's the honest counter-argument, and it deserves real weight before anyone declares a verdict. Ferrari has said versions of this before. Every team that underperforms points at strategy and execution, rather than admitting the car simply wasn't good enough, because that's the easier story to tell a nervous fan base. That skepticism is fair. It is also directly contradicted by 3 separate practice sessions of hard data collected, before a single strategic decision had even been made. The pace showed up on Friday, before qualifying, before the penalty, before the pit stop errors. Vasseur isn't asking anyone to trust his read of a chaotic Sunday. He's pointing at a Friday that nobody disputes. So what actually went wrong, if the car wasn't the problem? Follow the sequence in order, because each mistake sets up the next one. Hamilton loses a front row start to a 3-place grid penalty for blocking Piastri in qualifying, a call the team later admits reached him too late to matter. That drops him to 5th instead of 2nd. From 5th, he's stuck fighting through traffic he'd never have seen from the front row. A virtual safety car appears when Piastri's own car fails on track, and Ferrari reacts by pitting both cars, a decision built on watching Verstappen's tire wear rather than their own. Verstappen ends up doing something nobody predicted: 37 laps on the same set of soft tires, far longer than Ferrari's own model expected. The undercut that looked smart when Ferrari called it stops looking smart the moment Verstappen simply doesn't need to stop. Then, on top of all of that, Hamilton loses time in the pit box itself and picks up a 5-second penalty for a pit lane reading 1/10 of a kilometer per hour over the limit. None of that is the car degrading. Every single link in that chain is a decision, or a communication, or a margin measured to a decimal point that the car itself had nothing to do with. Vasseur's own accounting of the day makes this explicit. He said today it's probably a succession of mistakes, and named them out loud rather than hiding behind vague language. Starting with the start, the penalty, the pit stop that lost 2 or 3 tenths every single time. That's not a man protecting his own car's reputation by inventing excuses. That's a man walking through an actual list in order and pointing at exactly where each point disappeared. Here's the part that should worry Ferrari's rivals more than it comforts Ferrari's fans. The Hungaroring is precisely the kind of circuit where raw straight-line speed matters least and mechanical balance matters most. If the SF26 already produces the second fastest car on the grid there, on a weekend where almost everything else that could go wrong did go wrong, then the question isn't whether Ferrari has genuine pace. Friday already answered that. The real question is whether the execution can catch up to the car before that pace stops being wasted. Zandvoort is next, and it's being treated internally as a data-gathering weekend for Ferrari's engine upgrade rather than a target for victory. Monza is where the real test lands, Ferrari's home race, with a redesigned turbocharger reportedly worth around 30 horsepower against Mercedes' straight-line advantage. If that number holds, and if Ferrari can put together the one thing Hungary proved they didn't have, a weekend where the strategy, the penalties, and the pace all point the same direction at the same time, then this becomes a genuinely different second half of the season. Mercedes extended their constructors' lead to 72 points in Hungary, and Kimi Antonelli now leads the Drivers' Championship by 50 over Hamilton. Those numbers are real. They're also numbers that reflect Sunday's execution, not Friday's pace, and Vasseur just told you which one he thinks is the actual problem. Here's the verdict. A car can be fixed on the strategy side in a way a car that simply isn't fast enough almost never can be. Hungary didn't prove Ferrari has a pace problem. It proved, in Vasseur's own words, that Ferrari has an execution problem sitting on top of a car that was fastest or nearly fastest in every session that weekend. That's a very different diagnosis than the one most of the headlines gave it, and it changes what the second half of this season is actually about. So tell me, does Ferrari fix the execution before Monza, or does the same pattern of wasted pace show up again the moment it matters most? Predict it in the comments, and if you think this was the best-kept secret of the summer break, hit like and say so. Subscribe, because when that engine upgrade lands at Monza and gets tested against a car that's already this fast in the corners, you'll want to already be here for it. Until the next one.